Welcome back to Triple Scorpio. I honestly did not, based on how the past 2 weeks were going, I did not think I was going to be recording an episode so soon, but I was so inspired this morning that I was like, you know what? It's a gorgeous Sunday. I have a lot of free time today, thank heavens. I'm going to sit outside and record something for you guys and share some of my musings I've had occur to me this morning. I'm sitting out here on my acupressure mat. Love my acupressure mat, addicted to it. I'm gonna try to make this snappy because guess what, everyone? Boom, sound effect. Wheel, wheel, wheel. I'm gonna talk again about Cancer, Leo, and Aquarius. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about these things privately, and I want to share it because maybe you guys have been too. I feel like there's been more of an awareness of the way that we exist in the real world because of the effects of how we exist online in the sort of fantasy realm and projection and avatar land of the internet. And this morning I was reading a few articles, a few gorgeous essays, and it really sparked just a lot of these thoughts that I wanted to share with with the collective and whoever finds this. But this idea of becoming yourself and how we interact with the world based on who we think that is. It's all very apt based on what's happening in the sky right now. We're currently in a Mercury retrograde in Cancer, and if you listen to my last episode about the myth of Cancer and Jupiter moving through both Cancer and Leo, and kind of showing us where we're examining ourself and how our self is positioned in the world. And I think something that I may not have really dug deep on about these two signs, Cancer and Leo, is that they both relate to our inner child and also how we situate and how we form our identities based on where we're from in the sign of Cancer and the stories that we've been told versus how we want to present that into the world, how we want to express that into the world. How are we putting out our inner child and all of these things that we have come to identify with in the sign of Leo? But I think that a lot of those identity and identifying habits come from our roots in Cancer, come from our family and the story and the environment that we grew up in. There can be a lot of clinging to stories and memories from our past that helps us feel safe and helps us situate ourselves and be like, I'm this, you're that. And holding on to these can, in many ways, hold us back. And I think can also create a mask that we wear to the world that isn't necessarily true to ourselves when we're not being witnessed. And I think my generation, millennial and younger, really feels this deeply because the extent to which we've internalized the audience of social media definitely impacted the way we interact with the real world, the world that's not a fantasy or a projection or this digital playground that is the internet. So I want to just bring up a couple of ideas to think about during the rest of Mercury retrograde in Cancer, and once we get more into Leo season, which is going to be way more about our egos and our external projection of them. I don't know if I'm going to be super in depth with astrology here, but I think like you guys are kind of getting the gist of the Cancer Leo aspect of this, and then I'm going to bring it back around to the nodes with Leo and Aquarius, so bear with me. With our internalized audience that we've absorbed from being on the internet for as long as we have, we've developed this self-monitoring, this self-surveillance, which, you know, comes across, can be seen in so many different ways. And I do notice the irony of me recording myself and my thoughts to put on the internet with this, but this is honestly the medium that we have to express and disseminate information as well. So it's a complicated relationship. But I do want to bring up the way that we adjust our behaviors based on how we think we will be perceived. And the other night, I was having kind of an OCD PMS flare-up, and my fiance asked me, because he notices and sees my sort of behaviors, and he asked me whether I create these sort of like micro crises, which people who are on the OCD spectrum might understand, like creating an urgent issue that in your mind needs to be fixed right away, but in the grand scheme of things might not have much of an impact on your life. But he asked me if I do certain things because I'm afraid something bad might happen, classic OCD, or if I actually want to do them. Which brings me to my first quote from this amazing Unraveling article by Caitlin Morgan, where she's talking a little bit about this book called The Women Who Run with the Wolves, and the author is dissecting the story of Bluebeard. And she asks, you can spot Bluebeard within your own life when language like I should and I shouldn't arise. He has a very specific tone that lures the self into surrender and then punishes it, creating a cycle of self-betrayal that feels both enticing and humiliating. You just find yourself living the way you are supposed to rather than how you would desire to, which brings on this question, if you stopped living the way you're supposed to, what would you actually want? So the reason why I brought up the story where Sam asked me, are you doing something because you're afraid something bad would happen, or because you genuinely want to? And I think that we can apply that to these sort of choices that we make in regards to this internalized audience that many of us have been living with and are now becoming more hyper aware of because we think, am I making this choice because I want to adhere to a certain persona or version of myself, or am I doing it because I genuinely want to? And I don't want us to get caught up in, overthinking our decisions and all of this stuff, but I do think that we can probably look to choices that we make that feed into a projection of the self versus something that nourishes and feeds our true self and our private self, the self that we are when no one's watching. And to go back to our sort of internet upbringing, I think we might not even be aware of when we're doing these things. And I think I'm just sort of bringing it up to the surface to take a closer look at it. And I think that maybe as a prompt during these transits of Mercury retrograde in Cancer, and then the South Node in Leo, and Jupiter making all that South Node stuff bigger, I just want to kind of bring up whether you or I or anybody are doing things because it feeds our inner child, it feels like a true self-expression, or if we're doing something to position ourselves as a certain aspirational archetype, right? And this relates to this internalized gaze. And I think that women in particular are very susceptible to this because, it's a very common sort of gender studies examination of femininity and womanhood, in that like women feel as though they are the observer to themselves and simultaneously the observed object. So the existence of being a person aware of its own observation at all times and as an object to be consumed and witnessed rather than simply existing for the sake of existing. So I think everybody, like I say, along the gender spectrum experiences this, even more so now in the age of social media and this digital extension of self and the freedom that's promised with the commodification of the self. And I think these are things that are really going to come up during this Jupiter in Leo year, is understanding how we are sort of packaging ourselves as something to be consumed, or are we really expressing a true inner child joy that feels really authentic. I want to relate all of this a little bit to this concept of fantasy and reality versus these digital spaces that we exist in. And I feel like the internet kind of offers two ends of the spectrum where you can be this hyper perfect and curated version of yourself that you're really proudly presenting out into the world with no vulnerability and only showing the pretty and shiny parts of yourself or the parts that you think you should be proud of. And then you go to the other darker side, more shadow side of what the internet offers. And that's the environment where you can share things that you would never share in real life. Like truly these spaces where you can do or see or express the most depraved aspects of humanity. And both of those exist in this fake digital space. And I believe that we're going to start rejecting both of these digital spectrums a lot more. Or perhaps these digital environments are going to prove to be more linked to our egos and our lived reality than we thought they were. And, of course, this relates to the virus of artificial intelligence that has this fake humanity. I think no matter how primally and humanly we understand that the internet and the digital realm is not real, our very malleable and impressionable minds have been severely influenced by this very new, in the grand scheme of humanity, invention, detachment, and slow sort of separation from this thing that's become so ingrained in our lives is going to be a little bit painful because it's so enticing, it's so addicting, and we become so used to it that we think it is reality. And in many ways, because of this acceptance of it in our daily lives, it has become our reality. And I think that we're going to need to have to be very careful and sensitive with what we allow to feel real versus what actually is real. And I hope that that's making sense on some level. But I do foresee a lot of this Leo and Aquarius North and South Node eclipse cycle having a lot to do with what we're perceiving as real and extensions of our ego, and how that relates to the digital realm and what presents as human but really isn't human, and kind of trying to get in touch with our base consciousness that only humans have, that robots simply do not have, and remembering that we don't need to exist only as a projection of self. We can live the self. We can live in reality, and understanding how to extract yourself from those digital realms. I want to go back to the Mercury in Cancer retrograde of it all, because I talked a lot about the concepts of Leo and Aquarius and our egos and our senses of self, the collective versus the individual. I am sure I'm going to talk about this for the next 18 months, and I hope that you're all rocking with me. Would love to hear your experiences of all of this. It does seem from a lot of the media online that many people are interacting with these concepts. So yeah, hope this is validating in some way. I want to go back to memory and identity and all of the many different versions of us that live inside of us, and how we can kind of free ourselves of those things and also honor those parts of ourselves without being chained to them. And I think an interesting piece of media that illustrates the question I'm kind of bringing up that came up in my group chat recently, which was my friend saw the drama finally, and we were talking about it, and I think that, yeah, it's a comedy, and it's so absurd that this person's husband-to-be doesn't have the empathy of, wow, I can't believe you went through that, or I can't believe you were experiencing that at the time. So there's a lot of cultural layers to that film, but the one that I want to bring here to discuss is this concept of are you all the different versions of yourself that you were back then at the same time that you are this new person that is constantly evolving? Is it essentially just you are a Russian nesting doll that holds all of those parts within you? Or have we, on a daily basis, evolved past it? Like, are you dating your partner from when they were 13? Are you dating your partner from like their weird college days? There's so many things that we've done that we wouldn't do now. And I think that it's really important to free ourselves from those shackles and to allow other people to be freed from those shackles. Forgive, and you don't necessarily have to forget, but we do have to allow ourselves to be more, to not believe that those old versions of ourselves need to always be carried into the present, let alone the future. And if we allow those past parts of ourselves to inform our current identity in a toxic way, I think we can be really held back by that and be too rigid in who we are instead of existing in a curious, malleable state. So I want to read a quote from this great Substack that I follow called The Search. And the title of it is called Years Do Odd Things to Identity. And some of her subtitles are Identity as a Collection of Temporary Feelings, which relates to the cancer of it all, constantly feeling, constantly, over-identifying with those feelings, even though those feelings are in constant flux. And another subtitle she has is Memory Changes Who We Are, which is exactly what I was just saying. Are you the person you were or the person you remember being? And maybe we just need to let go of over-identifying with our past. And the quote I wanted to read from this amazing article, which I highly recommend, that I actually restacked on my Substack. The subtitle is Error 404, Identity Not Found. Maybe years do odd things to identity because identity was never something to be found in the first place. Maybe it was always something to be uncovered beneath the versions of ourselves we borrowed from everyone else. How can I become more myself when the self is not fixed, not finished, and never will be? So I want to bring all of these concepts back around to the monitoring that we do of ourselves versus the monitoring that we've internalized from the external and from the rules, either from our family or from our society, or the sort of restrictions that are real versus the restrictions that are mental constructs. So I think that those mental constructs can definitely be influenced by society, but can be perpetuated by our memories or the cages that we create for ourselves. And with that article that I just read from, says a lot about our internal feeling, emotional, memory-based restrictions that I'm talking about that we need to set ourselves free from. This article from the Unraveling Substack that I love brings in the more societal pressure that feeds all of this, that is external. So, like I mentioned before, she talks a lot about the Bluebeard story, which is examined in the Women Who Run with the Wolves book. And she writes, so if we look at Bluebeard as if he is the superego being the rules and structures that we absorb from society or our upbringing, sitting on our shoulder, we can quickly see how his rules about what doors we can open and which ones we shouldn't mirror into our reality. Bluebeard capitalizes off of insecurity, and he thrives off of a displaced sense of, quote, self. You first ignore his blue beard. Then you ignore his weird, strange key room rule. You gaslight yourself into living in Bluebeard's fantasy, a perfect little wife in the castle. Current work on alienation and internalized expectations shows a similar dynamic when external conditions of worth, like grades, performance, appearance, or social status, are absorbed as the, quote, only acceptable self. People report higher levels of self-estrangement, anxiety, and social withdrawal. One case study describes how academic pressure and conditional acceptance, and I would insert a conditional self-acceptance, created a fragile self-concept that was only restored with unconditional positive regard and self-acceptance. So this is a lot to chew on, And I think we're all very aware of this without even having to label it or describe it to such an extent. But I do think that when we allow these superficial markers to permeate to our inner world and into our conscious, unconscious, what have you, once that has seeped in, we've given away our own agency to these things that we were told were important, even if they may not be true or important to the existence of being a human in general. All of these external markers kind of amount to nothing if you are not able to love and accept yourself. And as we know, the only real validation that we need is self-validation and self-love, which is a very Leo-like concept and a very Leo theme that we all need to get on board with, that the validation is not outside, it's inside. And sometimes we don't need to let the external society regulate us too much, and that we can be our true self and express in this way without bringing the external in and using some powerful boundaries and maybe even rebelling against them, if that helps get you out of that cage. And it's really a lesson in not betraying your true self, whoever that is, who's constantly evolving, as I've mentioned a few times already, and accepting all of those many different versions of who you might be without needing external markers or playing into these superficial games. I think the story of Bluebeard is a beautiful example, like in this article where she talks so much about self-betrayal and this metaphor of the door that should remain locked is this idea that there is a part of ourselves that we lock away that maybe, again, I would relate to Jung's shadow, that it's always there. It's this constant presence. And if you don't look at it, you're not whole. You don't become the whole version of yourself because there's something that's still locked away. And I also think it's this part of ourselves that we reject in order to receive acceptance. And there may be a more fatal aspect to not looking at the truth, and in many ways opening that door, opening yourself up to the truth can set you free. And looking at the ugly sacrifice that's made for all of this external status is needed in order to set you free, because you need to see what sacrifice is really being made. I'm going to relate this all to Uranus, Aquarius archetypes, because like I was saying, sometimes it's really hard to put something back in the box once you've seen it. In many ways, I relate this to how we interact with technology. We have technology, we've been living with it. It'd be really hard to go back to life before it. Like I've said before, Uranus and Aquarius relates a lot to technology and these flashes of invention or consciousness or awareness that force us into the future because we can't go back to the past after we've seen them. Relating this to this incredible article on the Unraveling Substack, which I'm going to restack so you guys can find it easily. She says, in neuroplasticity language, the bleeding key in the story of Bluebeard also symbolizes the moment a new pathway begins to form. Awareness itself is a kind of rewiring. Once you open that door, you cannot just close it again and return to the, quote, fantasy from before. This is going to be really important to coming back to our authentic self and allowing these flashes of insight and important perspectives be opened, literally, like the door in Bluebeard. Open the door and see what needs to be seen in order to allow your personhood to return, allow your humanity to return, and to escape the fantasy of a facade of an external projection or the Matrix or whatever sort of mask we're feeding into. So because I just naturally gravitated into the Leo and Aquarius of it all, I want to bring up a few quotes from this amazing book that I've been teasing on this podcast called The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Guin. And as I was reading this book, I just felt like these Leo Aquarius themes were screaming out at me. And actually in my review of the book, when I finished it, was that I wrote, I don't believe that humanity needs to be all or nothing of one thing. I think that we can have creativity and joy and self-expression in an environment that is humanistic, socialistic, community-driven, and both of those things can feed each other equally. And please look out for that theme as we enter into the South Node in Leo and the North Node in Aquarius, because it's begging us to find a balance between those two. And this book, The Dispossessed, shows how both extremes can go wrong. Also, if anybody has some good book recommendations, please send them my way. I have been hoarding books because I was in a book drought recently. I was only reading like astrology textbooks, and now I'm just tearing through stuff on my list, and I'm just, in a very Cancerian way, I'm craving stories. I'm craving memory. I'm craving nostalgic. I recently rewatched Bend It Like Beckham, one of my favorite movies from growing up, and God, nothing hits quite like that movie. Consider this quote when thinking about the archetypes of Leo and Aquarius. Leo represents our joy. It represents everything that's fun. It represents, in many ways, the things that we want to do to express our pure happiness in our heart space. And Aquarius, as the opposite of that, is in many ways less about the self-expression and more about the collective and the collective's needs and what needs to happen and be done to serve the collective. And like I said, the nodes and the eclipses are going to represent where we need to find the good in both of these archetypes and dispel the bad, especially with the South Node in Leo. And I think that these concepts are something to really think about as we're moving towards creating a future that is more collective oriented rather than the sort of century of the self, to quote Adam Curtis and to bring him into this, that we've been living in. So I wanted to bring up this quote from the earlier part of The Dispossessed where he goes, "I wonder if it isn't all a misunderstanding, this grasping after happiness, this fear of pain, if instead of fearing it and running from it, one could get through it, go beyond it. There is something beyond it. It's the self that suffers, and there's a place where the self ceases. I don't know how to say it, but I believe that the reality, the truth that I recognize in suffering, as I don't in comfort and happiness, that the reality of pain is not pain, if you can get through it, if you can endure it all the way. Love is just one of the ways through. Sometimes the truth of life isn't really expressed when we're jovial and enjoying and happy and doing all these kinds of things, that the truth of our connection is actually in the things that we suffer collectively, and that can be a huge uniting factor and be a jumping off point to create a more loving society through sharing our suffering and uplifting ourselves out of it. I also highlighted this quote that's very Zapatista, if you're familiar with this, and also feels very Aquarius versus Leo. If we remember that Leo can represent the king and the royal and the figurehead, and Aquarius represents the masses and the worker and the collective. And the quote just says simply, "Paradise is for those who make paradise." And to bring it back to the Zapatista movement, they believed, like Emiliano Zapata, that the people that worked the land should own the land. And I believe that most people in society today would agree that we're very much not living in that truth. And it's something that we're all hoping to fight for, I imagine. I want to present all of these ideas in tandem is because I don't think that Leo and Aquarius I don't think Leo exists in a vacuum. I don't think Aquarius exists in a vacuum. I think they both exist to feed the other in the way that a classic opposition always does. There's a tension between them, and the contrast that they present to the other establishes what their purpose is, and it is a reflection of the other. All of the bad things of Leo can have their negative inverse in Aquarius, and all of the positive things of Leo can have their positive inverse in Aquarius. So keep all of these things in mind and understand that they are essential to one another. One really important thing that I've been thinking a lot with opposition aspects is to remember that it isn't a you versus me or an us versus them. It's a completion and a creation of a whole. So it's not a battle between wills. It's an agreement. It's a treaty. It's a compromise between the two that creates a healthy relationship. So if you see oppositions happening in the sky, as we know, the North and South Node are always in opposition. If you have those things in your own chart, if you find yourself experiencing an opposition aspect with another person, consider that. Consider that it doesn't need to be experienced in this sort of battle, in this, you're my op type of relationship. Try to embrace it as a you complete me, and you provide a mirror, an essential mirror to me that creates something bigger than the sum of its parts. This one is such a good one that brings in both of these concepts so well. On this main character's planet, there isn't money. So there isn't this false capitalist concept of, people only do shitty jobs because they need to make money, which is true in our society. But this book posits the question of what if there was a society where that didn't happen, and how does anything get done? And yeah, we'll learn more from this passage. It says, "Here you think that the incentive to work is finances, need for money, or desire for profit. But where there's no money, the real motives are clearer, maybe. People like to do things. They like to do them well. People take the dangerous hard jobs because they can take pride in doing them. They can egoize, we call it, show off to the weaker ones. Hey, look, see how strong I am? A person likes to do what he is good at doing. But really, it is the question of ends and means. After all, work is done for the work's sake. It's the lasting pleasure of life. The private conscious knows that. And also the social conscious, the opinion of one's neighbors. There is no other reward, no other law. One's own pleasure and the respect of one's fellows. That's all. When that is so, then you see the opinion of the neighbors becomes a very mighty force." I do think that this brings up a very interesting point of yes, as humans, we like to do things and we like to feel like what we're doing matters to something bigger than ourselves, which is a very Aquarian concept. And the pride in that brings a very Leo concept, is I am good at this and I'm proud of what I can make. I'm proud of what I can do. And I'm proud of what that makes me feel in the larger scheme of my society. You can do things that are for the greater good and that you personally are good at and that you take pride in. This combination, I think, is really important. The Aquarius archetype in its most undeveloped state becomes too connected to the hive mind and separates from its humanity. It goes too far in that direction. It separates from its individual joys that's typically found in Leo, and it goes too far into the unreality of digital spheres or the collective, and believes that the collective is more important than nurturing an individual spirit. I think this quote from the book expresses that really well, where it goes on to say, "It's always easier to not think for oneself. Find a nice, safe hierarchy and settle in." I think that sometimes being an individual that has to work to stay in touch with that spirit, sometimes it is way more simple to, instead of resisting the motions of a tide, to just go with the tide. I think that's where this sort of concept of Aquarius being a rebel in many ways can come in, because with this presence of the collective so prominent in the Aquarius archetype, eventually somebody needs to push back against that, and rebelling against something because you have gone high enough in that bird's eye view perspective to break free. It can be really difficult at first, and it can be really jarring, and it can be really uncomfortable, but it's so necessary. And not only is it necessary, but it's inevitable. I think this speaks to Aquarius's idealism. It says, if you can see a thing whole, it seems that it's always beautiful. Planets, lives, but close up, a world's all dirt and rocks. And day to day, life's a hard job. You get tired, you lose the pattern. You need distance and interval. And like I always bring up, Aquarius has this distance, this perspective. And I think that when you see something like this quote is saying from afar, it's easy to idealize it and see it as beautiful. And I think that Aquarius placements or Aquarius themes or transits can bring up like, oh, I don't necessarily want to get too close. Like when I get too close, it's not really the thing that I wanted it to be. And it's not how it looks when I'm actually removed and separate from it. So that's where we kind of get this aloof, this distance, all of these things that come up with Aquarius that we can start to more deeply understand with like, oh, that's perhaps why when you get too close, it's not as beautiful. And the nitty gritty of daily life can remove the idealism around those things. And I think that Leo, in contrast, kind of relishes in daily life. I mean, obviously Virgo is a very big concept of that, but like Leo can bring joy to the mundane, the earthly, the conscious, and it can make it fun. I feel like every Leo placement that you know can make the most mundane thing super fun. And that's because of a sort of excitement about everything, whether you're close up and actually wanting to be really close and wanting to live it, right? Leo is so much about life itself and the sun, the giver of life. So how are we getting stuck in an idealized big picture versus getting into the nitty gritty and the up close and experiencing the joy of that? And I think a really great answer I also highlighted after that quote that I just read says, the way to see how beautiful the earth is to see it as the moon. The way to see how beautiful life is from the vantage point of death. It's nothing to do with eternity. All you have to do to see life whole is to see it as mortal. All die, you'll die. How could we love each other otherwise? The sun is going to burn out. What else keeps it shining? This to me embodies the need for both ends of this spectrum. Our heart, our love, the sun that shines, and the vantage point of the negative of all those things, the inverse of all those things, the yin to the yang of all those things. That's what gives it the heft and the importance, is its opposite. If I haven't beaten that concept like a dead horse on this podcast enough, I just want to meditate on all of that as we go into South Node in Leo, North Node in Aquarius, is what vantage points can we experience the joys of life from more vividly, and what perspective do we need to adopt in order to find our true humanity in our heart. And I know that sounds super cheesy, but it also feels really essential to take on the needs and the pains of the collective and find a way to bring joy to our daily life. The relief, the negative space, all of those art history terms that I can't remember right now, but remembering that our humanity comes from our perspective, of course, but also our embracing of our individual joys, the creativity and the generative versus the consumptive. To sum up many of the things that I've been toying with, is to become yourself without the audience, to remember who that person is, and to try and remove the hyper digital unreality and enjoy and relish in the daily beauties of our physical reality, our active reality. I think this is going to create an interesting framework for the next 18 months with these upcoming eclipses. Then we can relate this back to how we are constructing our identities, whether that relates to our past, whether it's aspiring to a future. But in reality, our senses of self should be firmly rooted in the present with open curiosity and allowance and freedom to be changed, to be a vessel for experience, to observe ourselves kindly, and to allow ourselves to not be defined by others and to not internalize the other to the point that we restrict ourselves in our own minds and restrict our lives thusly. Thank you for coming along with me on this very roundabout journey, relating these more heady concepts of time, memory, identity, and allowing me to repeat certain words and ideas over and over again in different forms. But I really appreciate it, and I hope this sparked something interesting in you as it did in me. And yeah, leave a comment. Let me know how this is coming up. And if this isn't coming up, then keep it in your pocket and save it for later, because I'm sure it will. I look forward to seeing you here next time. Thanks for being here. Bye.